Hello again, and welcome back to another episode of Jefferson's Salute to the Presidents. I'm Thomas Watson, and this is my travel companion and star of the show, Thomas Jefferson. On this episode, TJ and I pay tribute to the life of our 17th president, Andrew Johnson, who was the first president to be impeached. So without further ado, please sit back, maybe grab a bowl of sweet potato pudding, which was Johnson's favorite, and enjoy the show. And try not to gag on that disgusting pudding. Andrew Johnson was born on December 29th, 1808 in this small two-room shack that once stood in downtown Raleigh. Over the years, this birthplace had been moved 4 times, finally ending up in Mordecai Historic Park in Raleigh. Today, the birthplace home is located roughly 1 mile north of its original location. This house had only 2 rooms, and Johnson later used his humble beginnings as a political asset. Andrew Johnson's birthplace before it was moved from its original location. This small monument where I'm standing marks the approximate location where Andrew Johnson was born. This location in downtown Raleigh is 1 block south of the state capitol building. It's believed the two-room shack where Johnson was born was an outbuilding for Castle's Inn, which sat on this site. The original birth house was moved from this location sometime between 1880 and 1884. At age 18, Johnson married 16-year-old Eliza McCardle on May 17, 1827, in Greenville, Tennessee. This was Andrew Johnson's first home he owned in Greenville, which he moved into with his new bride shortly after their marriage in 1827. The Johnsons lived in this home until 1851, at which time they moved a few blocks away to a larger house. 4 of Johnson's 5 children were born in this home, including their eldest child, Martha, who was born about a year after Andrew and Eliza moved into the house. There weren't any authentic furnishings in the home, which prompted me to pose on the fireplace mantel that was present when Johnson lived here. As I stood in one of the 3 fireplaces inside the house, it was easy to envision Johnson as he built a fire here to warm his young family. The future president was a tailor by trade. Shortly after moving into this house, Andrew opened his own tailor shop. Andrew Johnson purchased this tailor shop in 1834. To protect the historic shop from the elements, a memorial building was constructed around the wooden structure. Andrew Johnson's tailor shop in Greenville. As I stood on the window ledge of Johnson's tailor shop, it was almost as though I could hear Eliza reading to him while he worked. Andrew Johnson never attended school a single day in his life, and his wife tutored him to read and write. Eliza's tutoring sparked her husband's interest in learning, which eventually led to his political career. If my arms could move, I would scratch my head in wonderment of how a person who never learned to read or write before adulthood could become president. As a fine tailor, Johnson often boasted that his work never ripped or gave way. The shears and leather strap below me once belonged to Andrew Johnson, who used them in his tailor shop. I'm standing in the yard of the Dixon Williams house, which was built in 1821 in downtown Greenville. Just after Johnson was elected to the Tennessee House of Representatives in 1835, a reception was held for the new congressman inside this house. The home's owner in 1835 was Dr. Alexander Williams, who also hosted Andrew Jackson, James K. Polk, and Davy Crockett in this mansion. In 1843, Andrew Johnson was elected to the United States House of Representatives to represent Tennessee's first congressional district. Johnson served a decade in the House, but decided to not seek re-election in 1852. Instead, Johnson had his sights set on becoming governor of Tennessee. On October 17, 1853, Andrew Johnson became the 15th governor of Tennessee and served 2 terms. Even though the Tennessee Capitol building behind me was under construction during Johnson's terms as governor, he and other officials occupied rooms in the unfinished building. When his second term ended in 1857, Johnson was elected as senator to represent Tennessee in Washington. After he became a U.S. Senator on October 8, 1857, Johnson defended slavery in the South and supported the Fugitive Slave Act. But as Civil War loomed, he was the only Southern senator to denounce secession and uphold the Union, which caused him to be labeled a traitor in his native South. As a matter of fact, his life and the lives of his family were threatened. Johnson was also hung in effigy in Tennessee. President Lincoln was impressed with Johnson's courage and appointed the senator as military governor of Tennessee. Johnson became military governor of Tennessee on March 12, 1862, even though Isham G. Harris was still recognized as governor by the Confederacy. During his time as military governor, Johnson held the rank of brigadier general and did his best to rid the state of Confederate influence, even though he himself was a slaveholder. However, on August 8, 1863, Johnson freed all of his personal slaves. A little over a year later, on October 24, 1864, he freed all of the slaves in the state of Tennessee. During his term as military governor of Tennessee, which ended on March 4, 1865, Andrew Johnson resided in a house located where I'm standing. This was Johnson's field desk when he served as the military governor of Tennessee. This desk went with him on danger-filled excursions. In June 1864, President Lincoln decided to drop Hannibal Hamlin as vice president and replace him with Democrat Andrew Johnson to help balance out the ticket. Johnson took the oath of office as vice president on March 4, 1865. He held the office for only 42 days, when on April 14th, President Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater. The vice president had no way of knowing that George Atzerodt had been assigned by John Wilkes Booth to assassinate him as well, but the co-conspirator lost his nerve at the last moment. When the vice president was awakened from a sound sleep in the early hours of April 15, 1865, he rushed to Lincoln's bedside at the Peterson boarding house. When Johnson saw for himself the president was beyond recovery, he returned to his residence at the Kirkwood House. I'm standing at the site along Pennsylvania Avenue where the Kirkwood House once stood before it was demolished in 1874. While serving as vice president, Andrew Johnson resided in a ground floor suite in the Kirkwood House. When President Lincoln died at 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, Johnson recited the presidential oath of office in his parlor roughly 5 hours later. The Kirkwood House, residence of Vice President Andrew Johnson in 1865. Inauguration of Andrew Johnson, April 15, 1865. This Bible behind me was used by Andrew Johnson when he recited the presidential oath of office on April 15, 1865. It was nearly 2 months after Lincoln's death before the new president moved into the executive mansion. Johnson's rise to the highest office in the land was unexpected, and he had huge shoes to fill. Once he got comfortable, President Johnson began the undaunting task of continuing Lincoln's reconstruction of the South. Eliza Johnson, the new president's wife, arrived in Washington with the rest of the family on August 6, 1865. Too ill to serve effectively as First Lady, Eliza hardly ever left her second-floor bedroom. Although she left the social chores to their daughter Martha, Eliza did on occasion greet guests who came to visit her husband. First Lady Eliza Johnson. Hostess Martha Johnson Patterson. This rubber stamp and ink behind me was used by President Johnson to apply his signature to letters and documents. Earlier in life, Johnson had broken his arm. Since the bone wasn't set properly, the injury caused the president pain whenever he tried to write. I suppose this was the 1860s version of the auto pen. The president's biggest mistake during his time in office came on March 27, 1866, when he vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1866. While Congress overrode the veto, it convinced moderates there was no working with Johnson, and his chances for re-election in 1868 were doomed. Throughout his term, Johnson was in battle with Congress over Reconstruction, but he also didn't see eye to eye with some of his cabinet members either. When Johnson discovered Secretary of War Edwin Stanton was undermining his Reconstruction efforts, the president attempted to remove him from office. That move didn't set well with Congress, and on February 24, 1868, the House voted 126 to 47 to impeach Johnson for high crimes and misdemeanors. But when it came time for the Senate to vote on impeachment, the tally ended at 35 to 19. President Johnson had survived being removed from office by 1 vote. I'm standing near a handful of original tickets used during the impeachment trial of Andrew Johnson. Johnson was the first president impeached, but he certainly wasn't the last. The impeachment trial of President Andrew Johnson. At the Democratic National Convention in 1868, President Johnson was only supported by his home state of Tennessee. The party's nomination instead went to New York Governor Horatio Seymour. During his final months in office, the president pardoned Dr. Samuel Mudd and the other co-conspirators in the Lincoln assassination. On his last day in the executive mansion, incoming President Ulysses S. Grant refused to ride in the same carriage with Johnson to the inauguration. But it didn't matter. Andrew Johnson refused to attend his predecessor's inauguration. He was the fourth president to do this, following in the footsteps of John Adams, John Quincy Adams, and Martin Van Buren. Andrew Johnson purchased this two-story brick home in Greenville in 1851, but he didn't reside there much until 1869 after he left the White House. When Johnson returned to his home in 69, he was welcomed amid great festivity. The citizens called the former president a patriot. And perhaps he was. While Nebraska was the only state admitted into the Union during Johnson's administration, which gave us a total of 37, Andrew did his best to fulfill Lincoln's visions of Reconstruction. During the Civil War, Confederate soldiers occupied the house and left it in disrepair. When Johnson returned to this home after his presidency, he and Eliza had to whip the place back into shape. From the backyard, it was easy to see the two-level porch that highlighted the rear of the home. The Johnson family loved to sit on this porch and admire their farmland and fruit trees. This natural spring I'm standing near was where the drinking water for the Johnson home was retrieved from. Let's go through this doorway and visit the home of Andrew and Eliza Johnson. The interior of the home was awesome, as most of the furnishings were used by the Johnsons. I'm posing in the main entryway of the homestead. The president's personal walking sticks were to my left. The portrait of the president behind me in the parlor was saved when Martha Johnson wrote to her friends and had them remove the painting and other furnishings in the home before the Confederate soldiers arrived. Andrew and Eliza entertained guests in this parlor. Although Eliza's health was so poor, entertaining became difficult. During my visit to the home on May 15, 2021, I was taken on a self-guided tour where I mysteriously ended up on this marble-top nightstand in Andrew Johnson's first-floor bedroom. After my self-guided tour had finished, my photographer talked the National Park Service ranger into placing me on Andrew Johnson's bed. I had to pinch myself when I stood alongside Johnson's top hat and on his 150-year-old bedspread. The secretary desk in the corner of the bedroom was used by Johnson while he lived in the White House. The small table in the room was used as a school desk by the president's grandchildren during their time in the White House. Eliza's bedroom was on the second floor of the home. It was common during that time period for husbands and wives to have separate bedrooms. During her final years, Eliza suffered from tuberculosis and rarely left this bedroom. She sat a lot in her favorite chair and used the white pod on the floor when she was sick to her stomach. When the home was renovated years after the Johnsons had lived there, it was discovered Confederate soldiers had left a note on the wall written in pencil. The rebel soldiers wrote, "Andrew Johnson, the old traitor," when they occupied the house during the Civil War. When the Johnsons returned to the house after the presidency, Eliza covered the graffiti with wallpaper. Finished in the upper portion of the home, I was carried to the basement where I visited the dining room. Andrew Johnson was a Freemason, and you can see the Masonic ornament on the far wall. Andrew Johnson acquired this farmhouse, located just outside of Greenville, in the 1850s from a slave owner who mistreated his slaves. Once acquired, Johnson gave this home to his daughter, Martha Johnson Patterson, and her husband, David. On January 15, 1876, Eliza Johnson died in this house at the age of 65 from tuberculosis. She had outlived her husband by only 6 months. President Johnson came to this house occasionally to visit his daughter for the remainder of his life. On July 10, 1901, Martha died in this house 25 years after her mother's death. Martha was 72 years old. In retirement, Johnson couldn't stay away from politics. After unsuccessful campaigns for the Senate in 1871 and the House in 1872, the former president won election to the United States Senate in 1875. When Andrew Johnson recited the oath of office as a senator on March 5, 1875, he became the only former president in our history to serve in the United States Senate. Senator Johnson spoke on March 22nd in a special short session. During the speech, he lambasted President Grant for using federal troops in support of Louisiana's Reconstruction government. As soon as the special session had ended, Senator Johnson returned to his home and wife in Greenville. In late July 1875, convinced some of his opponents were defaming him in the Ohio gubernatorial race, Johnson decided to travel there to give speeches. The senator left this home on July 28th and headed for Ohio. Johnson made it 40 miles when he stopped at the farmhouse of his daughter, Mary Stover, located near Lisbethton, Tennessee. The small two-story building behind me is the old Stover House, which was built in 1797 and was once owned by Daniel and Mary Johnson Stover. Over the years, the historic home fell into disrepair. In 2004, Dr. Daniel Schumeyer purchased the building and had it moved to his property where it stands today. Not only was his daughter Mary there, but Johnson's oldest daughter, Martha, had been in the home visiting her sister when their father arrived. At roughly 4 p.m. on the 28th, shortly after having lunch inside this house, Andrew Johnson suffered a stroke while talking with his granddaughters. After regaining consciousness and paralyzed on one side, the former president ordered that no doctor or minister be called. The following day, when his condition didn't improve, Two doctors from Elizabethton arrived at the home. Although Johnson seemed to respond to the doctor's ministrations, he suffered a second stroke in the evening of July 30th. The Stover House in 1935. Thanks to the generosity of Dr. Schumeyer, I was allowed to see the interior of the home on May 10th, 2022. I'm standing on the fireplace in what appeared to be the first floor dining area of the home. It was here where Johnson suffered his first stroke. The portrait next to me was of President Johnson's youngest daughter, Mary. Although Daniel Stover died in 1864, Mary still owned the home when Andrew Johnson made his final visit in 1875. I'm in the upstairs bedroom where Johnson was taken following his first stroke. While the bed was a reproduction, this was the place where the president suffered his second stroke. With his physicians and family surrounding his bed, Andrew Johnson uttered his final words in this upstairs bedroom. "No, doctor, nothing more." At roughly 2 a.m. on July 31st, 1875, President Andrew Johnson died at the age of 66, and it happened right here. The death of Andrew Johnson, July 31st, 1875. From the bed, I looked around and saw the same walls Johnson saw during his final hours. Then I looked up and viewed the last thing Andrew Johnson saw before he died, the ceiling. This chest of drawers I'm standing on was owned by Daniel and Mary Stover and was situated in the second floor bedroom. The portrait above me was of Charles Johnson, the president's eldest son and Mary's brother. As I stood on this vanity once owned by the Stovers, it seemed as though I saw Mary looking in the mirror as she braided her hair. In this view of the entire second-story bedroom, I'm standing on the fireplace mantel beneath the portrait of President Andrew Johnson. One of the many highlights for me inside the old Stover house was when I was placed on the original floorboards in the upstairs bedroom. After I posed at the rear of the Stover house, I made the nearly 6-mile journey to the site where the historic home stood when President Johnson died in 1875. This stone wall I'm standing on marked the area where the old Stover house originally stood near the banks of the Watauga River. For a moment, when I was standing on the stone wall at the Stover house site, I thought I was Thomas Jackson instead of Thomas Jefferson. Yeah, I'm talking Stonewall Jackson. As I stood along the shore of the Watauga River, I wondered if Daniel and Mary's 3 children, Eliza, Sarah, and Andrew Johnson Stover, ever stepped foot in the shallow river. On August 2nd, 1875, President Johnson laid in state at the courthouse in his hometown of Greenville. The casket was closed because the body had begun to decompose. After he laid in state, the president's remains were transported to this section of land Johnson had owned, which he had marked with a willow tree taken as a shoot from Napoleon's tomb. During the Civil War, this area was known as Signal Hill because it overlooked the town. Now it's part of the Andrew Johnson National Cemetery. President Johnson was laid to rest on August 3, 1875. At his request, Johnson's body was wrapped in an American flag and his head rested on a copy of the Constitution. Following the death of Eliza Johnson on January 15, 1876, the First Lady was interred beside her husband. A few years after his death, Johnson's family had this 28-foot tall marble monument I'm standing on erected over the gravesite. From that point on, this area was called Monument Hill. When I arrived at the cemetery after dark on May 14, 2021, a bucket list wish came true when Bob Moldenhauer scaled the fence and placed me on the monument. I love to visit presidential grave sites, and there's no better time than after dark. This bronze Andrew Johnson, his shoulders draped in a cape of power, stares intently at the shrine enclosing his former tailor shop across the street. This statue of the three presidents born in North Carolina was on the grounds of the Capitol building in Raleigh. I wanted to get closer to the statue, but the grounds were closed to the public during my visit on July 26, 2020, due to the violent protests following the George Floyd killing. That's it for another episode of Jefferson's Salute to the Presidents. TJ and I hope you enjoyed the show and learned a little about the life of Andrew Johnson. Please do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. Maybe hit that like button below and share our show with your friends on social media. Our next episode will be one you won't want to miss, as it will feature our 18th president, Ulysses S. Grant. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you soon. So long.